In the meantime, the Senate is expected to vote today on a funding deal to avoid a partial government shutdown. President Trump and Senate Democrats did reach a deal last night. The agreement would fund all the government departments at stake, but for the Department of Homeland Security. The Senate's expected to vote today, with the House taking up the package on Monday.
As the Senate gavels into session, members are working on moving forward on a deal to fund the government and working on legislation desperately needed to rein in ICE's abuses.
Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. John. Okay, all right. The Senate blocked the Iran War Powers Resolution 5347, which looks like a Trump win, but one Republican already broke ranks, and that's the number that matters. To survive impeachment conviction, Trump needs 34 Republican senators to hold.
If Republicans are serious about the very reasonable demands Democrats have put forward on ICE, then there is no good reason we can't come together very quickly to produce legislation.
Now, funding is expected to run out tonight, just after midnight, hence why the House is not convening until Monday, and that's why we'll have to wait a minute. But the impact to the government, we are told, is expected to be minimal in the meantime.
With only a 6-vote margin on war powers, in a climate of low approval ratings, an ongoing Iran war, and growing bipartisan defections, his political survival is one major crisis away from the Republican firewall cracking beyond the point of no return. We are going to walk through every piece of it today, what that vote actually means.
The Senate will come to order. The Vice President, as President of the Senate, would like to give a brief statement with the indulgence of the senators. Today was a dark day in the history of the United States Capitol. But thanks to the swift efforts of U.S. Capitol Police, federal, state, and local law enforcement, the violence was quelled. The Capitol is secured, and the people's work continues.
What the impeachment arithmetic looks like, what would actually have to happen for the step-down scenario to move from speculative to real, and why the specific combination of war powers pressure, legal accountability, and declining approval is making that scenario more plausible than at any previous point.
We condemn the violence that took place here in the strongest possible terms. We grieve the loss of life in these hallowed halls, as well as the injuries suffered by those who defended our Capitol today. And we will always be grateful to the men and women who stayed at their posts.
Now let me give you the full context you need to understand why that vote is significant beyond its immediate procedural outcome, and why the specific numbers in that vote are the most important data point in the entire fate-sealing story. The bipartisan resolution that the Senate blocked was a War Powers Resolution brought under the War Powers Resolution of 1973. Its existence, the fact that it got to a Senate vote at all, tells you something important about the political environment. Bipartisan resolutions restricting presidential war powers do not get to Senate floor votes when the president's political position is secure and his party is unified behind him. They get to floor votes when enough members of the majority party are uncomfortable enough with the military action being conducted that the normal Senate leadership tools for blocking uncomfortable votes cannot contain the pressure. The fact that this resolution reached a floor vote and that it got 47 votes in a Republican-controlled Senate, including one Republican vote, is the signal that the Iran war is producing the kind of internal Republican discomfort that war powers resolutions are designed to express formally. And the one Republican who broke, joining all 47 Democrats to vote for the resolution, is the most important single data point in the entire vote, because that one Republican vote establishes that the wall of unified Republican support for the president's war powers is not impenetrable, that at least one member of the majority caucus concluded that the Iran airstrikes had crossed a line that made supporting unrestricted war authority politically untenable. In the context of the counterterrorism chief's resignation, the president's own appointee saying the Iran war was based on no imminent threat, that adds a specific credibility dimension to the war powers concern that makes the one Republican vote more significant than it would be in isolation. That Republican senator was not just responding to Democratic criticism of the Iran policy, They were responding to an inside account from a Trump-appointed official with intelligence access saying the legal and strategic basis for the strikes was inadequate. An inside account combined with the American deaths, the overwhelming public opposition, and the Strait of Hormuz crisis the strikes helped produce created the specific political conditions under which a Republican senator concluded that voting for the War Powers Resolution was more defensible than voting against it. And the question that every subsequent development in the Iran situation is going to test is whether additional Republicans reach the same conclusion, whether the one vote becomes 2 and then 3, and then enough to change the political calculation in ways that make the fate-sealing framing accurate in a more literal sense. Let me really dig into the full picture of what the Senate vote means and what the step-down scenario would actually require. There are 3 distinct dimensions that each deserve careful treatment. The impeachment arithmetic, what the specific numbers look like, how many Republican votes would actually be needed for conviction and removal, and why the current political environment makes that arithmetic more uncertain than it appeared even months ago. The Constitution requires a 2/3 supermajority of the Senate to convict and remove a president following an impeachment trial. In the current Senate with 100 members, 67 votes are needed for conviction. Democrats currently hold 47 seats, meaning they need 20 additional Republican votes to reach the conviction threshold. Alternatively, if all 47 Democrats vote for conviction, the president needs 34 Republicans to vote to acquit to survive. That 34 holdout floor, the minimum Republican support needed to block conviction, is the specific number that political analysis of the current Senate situation focuses on. And the vote where 52 Republicans voted to protect the president's war powers establishes that there are currently at least 52 Republicans willing to vote with him on at least one major contested question. But the war powers vote and an impeachment conviction vote are different political calculations. War powers is a policy question about executive authority that many Republican senators have principled reasons to support regardless of their personal views. Impeachment conviction is a personal political question about whether the president has committed high crimes and misdemeanors that requires a more direct judgment about his fitness and his conduct. The second impeachment produced 7 Republican senators voting for conviction. 7. In a Senate where Republicans held a majority, 7 crossing on the most serious impeachment charge ever brought. The question the current Senate situation poses is how those numbers look in a Senate with a Republican majority in a second term, with a documented record of constitutional overreach across multiple domains, court defiance, unauthorized military action, emergency power abuse, that is considerably more extensive than the conduct underlying either previous impeachment. If the second impeachment produced 7 Republican conviction votes and the current record is substantially more extensive, the political calculation for Republican senators facing the question is different than it was before, particularly for those in states where the Iran war, the approval numbers, and the overall second-term record are creating genuine electoral vulnerability. The war powers trajectory. The Iran situation is the specific ongoing development most likely to produce additional Republican fractures. The current political consensus among Republican senators, demonstrated by the voting pattern, is that protecting the president's Iran war authority is the right political choice. That consensus is held together by a combination of deference to the commander-in-chief, partisan loyalty, and the assessment that the political cost of breaking with the president exceeds the political cost of supporting a war that most Republican voters currently support or at least accept. The specific developments that could break that consensus are identifiable. Additional American casualties in the Iran operation, particularly if those casualties are accompanied by reporting that confirms the counterterrorism chief's account of inadequate threat assessment, would create political pressure on Republican senators in states with significant military communities. A significant escalation of the Strait of Hormuz crisis, particularly if oil prices spike to levels that create visible cost of living impact for American consumers, would create economic pressure that translates into political accountability for the senators who voted to protect the war authority that produced the crisis. And any additional revelations about the decision-making process behind the Iran strikes, any additional inside accounts corroborating the description of an echo chamber driving the decision, would add to the documented case that the war was conducted without the imminent threat basis the legal framework requires. The third dimension is the step-down mechanics. The headline framing requires understanding what would actually have to happen for a presidential resignation to become a realistic outcome. The historical precedent of Nixon is the most instructive available model for how that scenario develops. Nixon did not resign because Congress voted to force him out. He resigned because a combination of factors, the Supreme Court ruling ordering the release of the tapes, the House Judiciary Committee passing impeachment articles with bipartisan support, and most critically, a delegation of senior Republican senators telling him privately that he did not have the votes to survive an impeachment trial in the Senate, combined to make resignation the less damaging political option compared to the alternative of a full impeachment trial and likely conviction. The specific moment that broke Nixon's calculation was the private Senate count. The assessment by Republican leaders that the votes for conviction were there, that the holdout floor could not be held, and that a trial would produce a conviction that would be worse for Nixon's legacy and the Republican Party than a resignation. The analog for the current situation, the scenario in which the step-down imminent framing becomes reality rather than speculation, would require a similar combination, a House impeachment vote, which a Democratic majority that the upcoming midterms could produce. A private Senate assessment delivered by Republican leaders that the conviction votes are there and the holdout floor cannot be held, and a calculation by the president that resignation produces a better outcome than the alternative of conviction. A calculation that his documented relationship to accountability suggests he would be extremely reluctant to make, but that the combination of legal accountability pressure, declining approval, and Senate arithmetic might eventually force. The margin on the war powers vote, and specifically the one Republican defection, is the most important single data point in the entire fate-sealing story. It establishes that Republican unity on the most aggressive second-term power claims is not absolute, that at least one member of the majority caucus has crossed the line on a major contested question, and that the political conditions for additional crossings exist and are developing. In a Senate with this margin, one defection on any vote is noted, it is tracked, it is analyzed. It creates a permission structure for other members who are privately uncomfortable with the same vote to assess the political cost of following. The senator who crossed demonstrated that it was survivable, that the political cost of voting against the president on the Iran war powers question did not immediately produce catastrophic political consequences. And that demonstration is the information that other Republican senators with private doubts about the Iran policy are now factoring into their own calculations. The one becomes the baseline for the next one, and the next one becomes the baseline for the one after that. In the incremental erosion of Republican unanimity that the Nixon model shows is the precursor to the Senate calculation that makes resignation the less damaging option. The impeachment arithmetic, specifically the relationship between the current Republican holdout baseline and the holdout floor needed to block conviction, defines the specific political space within which the step-down scenario becomes realistic. And that space is considerably narrower than the public posture of invincible political strength suggests. The president needs 34 Republican votes to survive conviction. He currently has 52, a cushion of 18 votes. 18 Republican senators would have to cross simultaneously on an impeachment conviction vote for the removal threshold to be reached. That sounds like a lot, but consider the context. The second impeachment produced 7 crossings in a Senate where Republican unity was stronger, in a situation where the conduct underlying the charge was less extensive than the documented second-term record. The current record, court defiance, unauthorized military action, emergency power abuse is considerably more extensive. The political environment, low approval, Iran war backlash, tariff ruling defeat, bipartisan Senate defections is considerably more hostile. The 18-vote cushion is real, but the conditions for eroding it are present and developing. And every additional Republican defection on any major question reduces the cushion and changes the political calculation for the next potential defector. The Nixon model, the private Senate assessment that the conviction votes were there, is the specific historical template for understanding how a step-down scenario actually unfolds. The conditions that produced that assessment in 1974 are developing analogs in the current political situation that make the scenario worth taking seriously as a realistic possibility, rather than purely as political fiction. Nixon faced a combination of Supreme Court adverse ruling, House impeachment article passage with bipartisan bipartisan support and private Republican Senate assessment of the conviction vote count. The current situation includes Supreme Court adverse rulings. It is one midterm election away from House impeachment article passage, which the president himself has acknowledged as a likely consequence of a Democratic House majority. And the private Republican Senate assessment, the internal calculation of whether the holdout floor can be held, is the specific unknown that the war powers vote is now informing. If Republican senators are privately counting votes and concluding that the cushion is eroding faster than expected, that the 18-vote margin is not as secure as it appears, the private assessment that produced Nixon's resignation calculation is beginning to develop. That assessment, when it reaches the point where Republican leadership communicates it privately, is the specific moment that makes the step-down imminent framing accurate rather than speculative. Here is what we need to watch as the Senate and the overall political situation continues to develop. The Iran war trajectory, whether additional casualties, additional constitutional overreach, or additional inside accounts like the counterterrorism chief's resignation produce additional Republican defections on war powers votes, is the most immediately consequential pending variable. Each additional Republican crossing on any major question related to the Iran situation reduces the holdout floor cushion and changes the private Senate vote calculation. The upcoming midterm elections, and specifically whether the combination of low approval, Iran war backlash, and economic pressure produces the House flip that the president himself has acknowledged as the trigger for impeachment proceedings, is the structural political variable that determines whether the House impeachment component of the Nixon analog develops. And the private Senate conversations, the internal Republican discussions about the war power situation, the Iran policy, the overall second-term record are the conversations that will eventually produce the kind of private assessment that changes presidential resignation calculations. Those conversations are not visible in public reporting, but they are shaped by every data point that is visible, every additional Republican defection, every declining approval number, every additional crisis that the administration's policies produce. Here is the bottom line, the thing I want you to carry away from everything we covered today. The Senate voted to block a resolution restricting Iran war powers with one Republican breaking to vote with all Democrats. That one defection, in a Senate where the president needs 34 holdouts to survive conviction, is the data point that defines the specific political space within which the step-down scenario is developing. The impeachment arithmetic, the 18-vote cushion between current Republican support and the conviction threshold, is narrower than the public posture of invincibility suggests, and the conditions for eroding it are present and developing in the Iran war situation, the declining approval numbers, and the bipartisan defection pattern documented across this entire session. The Nixon model, private Senate assessment of conviction vote count producing resignation calculation, is a historical template for how the step-down scenario actually unfolds. And the conditions that produce that assessment are developing analogs in the current political situation. The step-down is not imminent in the sense of happening tomorrow, but the Senate vote has sealed a specific fate. The beginning of the incremental Republican erosion that the Nixon model shows is the precursor to the private assessment that makes resignation the less damaging option.